The Peregrine Falcon. The Peregrine, strong, handsome, powerful, and sleek. The Peregrine, prized by kings, prized by falconers around the world for more than 2,000 years. The Peregrine Falcon, the fastest bird in the world with diving speeds of almost 200 miles per hour. The Peregrine, weighing less than 3 pounds, flying with speed, power, and grace, an important part of nature's balance. The Peregrine, an endangered species. The Peregrine Falcon, along with the bald eagle, the osprey, the brown pelican, and other wildlife, has been forced to the verge of extinction by DDT and other pesticides. Before the use of DDT, the breeding range of the Peregrine Falcon extended along the eastern coast of Canada, down the United States along the Jersey coast, and throughout the Mississippi Valley, as well as Alaska, the Canadian Rockies, and the Rockies of the United States. As man began to use DDT for insect control, the food supply of the falcon, the smaller prey species, mostly birds, soon became contaminated with DDT, and in turn the falcon began to store the pesticide poisons in their body tissues. This buildup in the body tissues finds its way to the eggs, where it kills the embryo or weakens the shell so that it cannot withstand the weight of the incubating bird. As a result, no peregrines have fledged east of the Mississippi River in over 20 years. And there remains only a small population left in the Rocky Mountains of the United States. Population still exists in Alaska and Greenland, but these numbers are also diminishing. The last known breeding location of the Peregrine Falcon in New Jersey was on the Palisades along the Hudson River. Fortunately, DDT had not been used in New Jersey and most other states since the early 1970s. And the endangered species biologists of the Division of Fish, Game, and Shell Fisheries felt that it was not too late to save the Peregrine Falcon from extinction in New Jersey. The story of saving the Peregrine Falcon began on the Colville River in Alaska in the spring of 1967, when a team from Cornell University's Laboratory of Ornithology and the Peregrine Fund visited one of the remaining breeding grounds. The object of the search was to find 5 or 6 young peregrine falcons, bring them back to Cornell University, and determine if they could be raised and bred in captivity. Ultimately, scientists hoped to restock areas of the United States which were not producing peregrine falcons. Since the falcons normally nest on rocky cliffs, the going wasn't always easy for the Cornell team as they searched for the fledglings. Finally, success. Young fledglings are located and identified as peregrine falcons. The research team was able to locate 5 young peregrines, approximately 4 weeks of age. They still had some down feathers and their wings were not developed for flight. With the capture of these young peregrines, the trip was a success. After returning from Alaska, the young peregrines were taken to the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology, where the long and careful process of trying to raise them in captivity and later to have them breed began. The Cornell University Laboratory of Ornithology is one of the leading raptor research centers in the world. Here in this breeding barn, there are 16 breeding and flight chambers where the birds are housed under simulated natural conditions. The Laboratory of Ornithology gathered a large amount of information which indicated that DDT and its derivatives, DDD and dieldrin, have been responsible for the demise of the peregrine falcon, the eagle, and other raptors in the United States. The research work at Cornell University proved successful. During the spring of 1975, a total of 25 young peregrine falcons were hatched. 3 peregrine falcons were made available to New Jersey to attempt a transplant. This transplant is known as a hacking experiment, where the birds are reared without parents in an enclosed chamber and released when able to fly. Working on a tight schedule, the biologists of the New Jersey Division of Fish, Game, and Shell Fisheries undertook a search for the best location to attempt this transplant. The cliffs of the Palisades were the last known breeding site of the falcons in New Jersey. It was determined that for environmental reasons, lack of adequate food supply, and the accessibility of the Palisades to the public, that the ancestral site was not adequate. Using a helicopter, a survey of the introduction sites was undertaken, and the marshlands around Barnegat Bay seemed to provide what was needed. The site was removed from public access. There appeared to be an adequate supply of prey species, and the area was relatively free from industrial and automobile pollutants. In addition, these wetlands were protected under the New Jersey Wetland Act, and therefore would probably remain for a number of years. The final selection was a site near Island Beach State Park in Ocean County. The location was accessible only by boat, contained an adequate supply of prey species such as blackbirds, starlings, and shorebirds. This site also had the advantage of having a houseboat nearby that could be used as headquarters for personnel and supplies during the months that would follow. The location wasn't selected until mid-June. Only a few weeks were left in which to prepare the site and have it ready for the birds' arrival on July 3rd. It was decided that the best environment to encourage the peregrine falcons to nest would be to simulate as much as possible the high nesting sites of the Alaskan cliffs. Therefore, a 40-foot high tower had to be constructed on the tidal marshes, which would in effect become a cliff house for the peregrines. The Ocean County Mosquito Commission helped in this initial work by supplying the crane and manpower to assist in placing the tall poles which would serve as the tower structure. By constructing the tower in a remote wetland location, it was felt that the tower could become a permanent home in which to hack the young peregrines. Hopefully, these young falcons, which fledged from this tower, would return in 2 or 3 years to nest and raise their young. A special rearing box was constructed in which the young birds would be enclosed and fed daily until they developed their wing feathers, at which point they would be released into the wild. This special rearing box is 6 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet high and is large enough to allow the falcons to flap their wings while they're growing. To simulate the natural nesting site of the falcons, more than a ton of washed gravel was hauled by boat to the site. By lining the nesting box with this gravel, the falcons would have a natural surface in which to walk and to feed, and the weight of the gravel would also add to the tower's stability. About 3 inches of gravel was spread on the floor of the box and the porch, which the falcons would later use to sun. The final step in completing the tower was to install climbing spikes so the observers could feed the birds daily. The tower was completed by July 3rd, and the equipment and supplies were stored in the houseboat. This houseboat would be the home of the researchers for the next 8 weeks. Without leaving, they would watch the box day and night to observe, feed, and learn the growing and feeding habits of the young peregrines. On July 3rd, a special research team headed by Dr. Stanley Temple arrived at the site from Cornell University with 3 young falcons, 3 weeks old, which had been hatched and reared at Cornell. These young peregrine falcons will be fed daily until they develop their flight feathers and are released into the wild. Hopefully, they will learn to hunt and kill prey species on their own and become established in New Jersey as a breeding population. As these peregrines are placed in their new home on the Jersey marshes, this is only the 2nd time that they have been handled by human hands. The first was during their capture at Cornell. Every effort is made to preserve the fledglings as wild birds, not to tame them in any way. During the next few weeks, along with observing and keeping notes, one of the daily chores of the research team was to feed the young falcons the chickens supplied by Cornell. Twice a day, the trip to the nest was made and a fresh chicken was placed in the box and any uneaten chickens removed. It was necessary to maintain cleanliness to prevent predators from seeking any leftovers. One of the final tasks of the research team was to release the young falcons for their first flight and also to install a small radio transmitter on each bird. The transmitters had an assigned frequency so that the birds could be tracked individually. The transmitters would send out the falcon's own signal for a distance of up to 3 miles. In addition, each bird was banded with a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service band and a blue leg band. In late August, when the Falcons were 8 weeks old, after they had tested their wings in the box and developed their flight feathers, the birds were released for their first flight. With little hesitation, bird number 1 came out of the rearing box, looked at the wide world around him, and then took off over the Jersey marshes. The second falcon preferred gliding to wing flapping and soared out over the marsh. For the next month, the young peregrines considered the tower on the tidal marsh near Barnegat Inlet as their roost site at night and a familiar landmark as they learned to hunt for prey species during the day. In nature, these birds would be taught to hunt by their parents. Here, released from captivity for the first time since hatching, they had to learn to hunt and fly on their own. An abundance of small birds and other prey species in the Barnegat Bay area made it easy for the birds to learn to hunt. Their initial flight patterns and feeding habits were studied carefully by the research team through radio telemetry and by visual tracking during the first few weeks. As the birds kept returning to the tower daily and using it as a natural eyrie, the hope rose that they might return in a few years and eventually breed at the tower. The Cornell Peregrine Fund plans to release several hundred young peregrines in towers such as this throughout the United States during the next few years. This experiment is the first time in history that the Peregrine Falcon has been encouraged to fledge in a man-made tower on the tidal marsh. In the early part of September, the batteries of the leg transmitters died, and it was necessary to replace them. To capture the peregrines, a pigeon was placed on a string to simulate a small bird caught in the grass. The peregrines attacked this pigeon, became entangled, and the transmitters were removed and replaced. All 3 Peregrine Falcons were recaptured and provided with new tail feather transmitters. This was the last time these birds were touched by human hands. The falcons are growing and becoming stronger. To continue the tracking, the new transmitters were installed at the base of the tail feathers. This did not interfere with the normal flight of the bird. After the transmitters were installed, the birds were released, hopefully not to be caught again for the rest of their lives. In spite of the handling by man, the birds remained wild, and the team could not get within 100 yards of the tower without frightening the birds away. Gradually, the birds traveled farther from the rearing site as they ranged out over the shoreline, trying their wings and searching for food. This was the height of the fall migration of shorebirds, and the prey species were in abundance. Favorite foods of the falcons were sanderlings, sandpipers, terns, blackbirds, black-bellied plovers, and oyster catchers. In no case did the falcons kill other than for food, and they took only 1 or 2 birds a day for survival, following the pattern of picking out the weaker of the species. The falcons have now roamed as far as 15 miles from the tower, and due to the 3-mile limit of the tracking equipment, it was necessary to use a boat to locate them and chart their habits as they moved over the Jersey wetlands. Gradually, the birds became part of the environment, moving farther away and one by one, not returning to the tower, but nesting on trees and poles around Island Beach State Park. Finally, for longer range tracking of the peregrines, a helicopter was used to follow the signal of the transmitters on the birds. As a result of the birds extending farther and farther out from the tower, the research team realized that the birds were indeed becoming part of the natural scene. Research has shown that 65% of young peregrine falcons normally perish each year. A large number of introduced birds will be required to have a successful reintroduction of the falcon and to provide a breeding stock for future generations. During 1976, a second hacking tower was built, this one at the Brigantine National Wildlife Preserve. From a safe distance, spectators observed the 4 young peregrines that were hacked from this tower. The original tower at Barnegat fledged 4 falcons in 1976, making a total of 10 peregrines fledged during the first 2 years in New Jersey. In 1977, a 3rd tower was built, this one near Manahawkin on the west side of Barnegat Bay. The research team lived in a small house trailer on the marsh. They fed and observed the falcons daily. After 49 days, the birds were released. On all 3 towers, a total of 12 peregrines were fledged during 1977. Perhaps the most encouraging part of the program happened at the tower at Barnegat. In the spring of 1977, a male falcon, hacked there in 1975, returned to the tower and made it his home. When the new fledglings were placed in the tower in July 1977, the adult male protected the tower by diving and circling over the researchers. After the young falcons were released, the adult took over and began to hunt and feed his adopted family. Researchers counted over 19 kills in one day as the adult brought food to the young birds at the tower. The return of this adult to the tower was a significant breakthrough, indicating that hacked birds will return to a man-made structure and display parental behavior. By mid-August, the 5 young falcons were ranging out from the tower with the adult male as they learned to hunt and make kills of their own. It is work like this, by dedicated people working with patience and care, through the Division of Fish, Game and Shell Fisheries Endangered and Non-Game Species Project and the Peregrine Fund at Cornell, that can restore to our environment what we have destroyed with haste and carelessness. For most people in their everyday life of work, travels, and hurry, a peregrine falcon may well remain a thing of the past, without consequence. But there is something that compels thinking men and women dedicated to an endangered species on this planet of ours to do something, to act. Fledgling falcons growing up on the Jersey marshes may seem indeed a small effort in the restoration of an entire species, but it is something, a positive action. And as Terence said, when we cannot act as we wish, we must act as we can. And for those familiar with the plight of the peregrine falcon, caused by mistreating our environment, there is something that compels us to correct this wrong. Perhaps it is nothing more than the simple words spoken by Mrs. Hubbard. The earth is bright, and I am earthly, so I love it well. Though heaven is holier and full of light, yet I am frail, and with frail things would dwell.
Hi, I'm Pete McLean with the Department of Environmental Protection, the Division of Fish and Game. I'm here today with Dr. Tom Kay, Professor of Ornithology at Cornell University and Director of the Peregrine Fund. Tom, you're down today to look at the sites we have here in New Jersey and also possibly look around to see if we might find a couple of the young birds that have wintered over here for the past year. Tell us a little bit about what you're trying to do this year and a little bit about this program.
Well, Pete, as you know, we've had one of our birds here for 3 years at Barnegat. And he's fully adult now and sexually capable of mating, and we're very hopeful that this bird that was seen here recently may be a potential mate for him. We'd like to identify the birds if we can while we're here and see if they are ours, in fact. And then if they mate, we'll move on to some other site, pick a 4th or a 5th site here in New Jersey and continue releasing young birds there until we get a 2nd pair, and then we'll continue that way right down the line until we have half a dozen pairs established in New Jersey. The program so far in New Jersey, I think, has been quite successful. We have put out about more than 20 young birds now, and as far as we can tell, perhaps half of those, or maybe perhaps a little more than half of them, have survived through their first year. We should have, there should be 8 or so birds around probably this spring and summer in New Jersey from our past releases. We'll continue to put young birds out at the towers until we get pairs established. Now, here we have an interesting situation because we've had an adult bird now 2 years running. We thought maybe he was paired up briefly last spring, as you recall. If he doesn't attract an adult female this year, then another possibility that we could try would be to provide him with an adult female, which we have at Cornell now in our hawk barn, and see if she would accept him at the tower here at Sedge as a mate and establish a breeding pair with him.
Well, Tom, well, this would be a really unique type of experiment. Has this been done before, where you're bringing a mature female in or a male in to mate with a bird that has been in an area?
We have not done it. It was an idea that we originally thought about when we first started the program some years ago. Apparently, it may have been done in England back in the 1800s, I understand from an elderly gentleman with whom I was speaking recently. Some of the falconers in Scotland apparently released trained birds as adult pairs and established them on cliffs, and this sort of reinvigorated my enthusiasm for perhaps trying something like that here.
Well, Tom, as I understand it, the Peregrine Falcon has not bred east of the Mississippi in at least 25 or 30 years. In other words, working through the Peregrine Fund with these hacking stations and possibly with this technique, it might be possible that we will have breeding Peregrine Falcons in the East Coast here within the foreseeable future.
We could have them this year, or certainly within the next year or two. By 1980, certainly, we should have established some. A lot of people wonder, Pete, why we're interested in New Jersey and the salt marshes along the Atlantic coast, because it's not the natural nesting habitat of the peregrine. In the old days, they nested, as you know, on cliffs along rivers and in the mountains, in the Appalachians. And they were not out here on the coast because there simply wasn't suitable nest sites for them. But we like the coastal salt marshes because, as you know, it's a very rich environment. There are lots of small birds available for the peregrines for food in these areas. There are not some of the predators that we have to contend with at the natural cliffs, like great horned owls and raccoons, so that we can get a maximum number of our young birds fledged into the wild here. The only problem is that providing them with a nest site that they will accept, and we think that these towers probably are going to be it.
Well, Tom, in this era of environmental protection, I think it's sort of a credit to the state of New Jersey, the fact that we did get the Wetland Act through, which has allowed us to protect these tidal marshes up and down the coast. Secondly, DDT, which I understand was one of the main problems with the Peregrine Falcon, has been eliminated essentially from the environment. And it certainly looks like, through modern environmental protection and regulations, that we may be getting the upper hand on some of the problems we've had in the past.
Well, DDT is not eliminated from the environment yet, but it certainly has been greatly reduced in the last 10 years, and as long as we continue not to use it anymore in our country, hopefully it will eventually disappear. But you're right. Habitat protection is certainly one of the most essential things in any of these recovery programs for an endangered species. It doesn't do any good for us to breed the birds in captivity. We can breed thousands of them in captivity, but if there's no habitat for them to exist in, it's a wasted effort.
Now, how about public participation? I think everybody, particularly along the Jersey coast, has become familiar with the peregrine because of your work down here and the hacking stations. How can the public actually participate in this peregrine program?
Well, we have a lot of interested bird watchers, as you know, who report sightings of our peregrines. They are marked with colored bands and with tail streamers and other devices, and we get frequent reports from bird watchers, and that's been very helpful. We have other students and other amateur naturalists who actually work with us at the hack sites, and of course we can always accept help from the public financially. This program does cost a lot of money, and we at Cornell we set up a thing called the Peregrine Fund about 7 years ago when we first got going, and they got the idea, by the way, from a couple of young lads in California who took up a collection among their schoolmates and sent us $2 unsolicited. And so we thought, well, if it works once, maybe it'll work 2 or 3 times. So we established the fund, and we've now had over 3,000 people contribute to it. And in addition to individuals, we have a number of conservation organizations like the National Audubon Society and the World Wildlife Fund and others that have contributed and helped support it. And now, thankfully, states like New Jersey and Pennsylvania and others, and the federal government has become heavily involved in the financing of the program.
How many birds do you produce a year, Tom, up at Cornell?
Last year our total production last year, east and west, was 91. I've forgotten exactly how that broke down at Cornell. I think it was 70-odd that we produced at Cornell last year. We expect to break 100 probably this year, or right around there anyway.
That's great. Well, the Peregrine Falcon, of course, is one of the most endangered birds in the United States at the present time. And actually, this program is a real management program where we're actually doing something for the bird. You're actually trying to reestablish this bird, which is extirpated on the East Coast, as a viable population in the future.
Right.
So we're looking very much forward to having more birds. Hopefully your program will work out here with the hacking and also with the introduction of a breeding bird with the bird we have. And possibly we can reestablish this peregrine falcon as a nesting bird in New Jersey with a minimal amount of time.
There are a couple of other tricks that we could try. We haven't done it yet, but they're on the drawing board. One method that we have used in the West is this idea of cross-fostering young peregrines into the nests of some other wild species. A good candidate might be the red-tailed hog, and allow that species to rear our birds up to fledging. That would save us a lot of human effort if that would work. Another possibility would be this falconry technique that I referred to earlier, where two birds are actually trained and flown for a period of months in an area until they become established there, and then released. After they're fully adult and fully capable of taking care of themselves, they'd be less likely to be killed by a predator or shot, for that matter, by a human being. Shooting is probably one of the problems that we're going to have to continue to face for a while, and there, again, public education, I feel, is the solution to the problem, and the more that people know about the peregrine and understand its beauty and what it is, I think the less of that sort of thing we'll encounter in the future.
Well, Tom, I feel the public is really coming around. Years ago, it was in vogue to shoot the chicken hawk. And what we've seen in the past few years, people have really come to respect the birds of prey. And we find that our violations are dropping way off, that people are saying it's a hawk, it's part of the environment, it has a right to be there, it's not taking away from man.
Well, you can see this in the band recoveries, too. In the old days, a 10% band recovery on hawks was to be expected, and now it's dropped way down to, I think, around 1% or maybe even less than 1%. Most that is from shooting. Most of the recoveries today are from birds that have been trapped by other banders. So it is getting better in the East that way.
Of course, something to remember, too, is that these peregrine falcons, I understand, that about 70% of the birds that are hatched each year will die from natural causes. Is this correct?
I hope it's not quite that high, but certainly it's 50%, and it may go up from there depending on the circumstances. But if they make it through the first year, then they have a good chance of surviving as adults at a much better rate, probably 15% to mortality, something like that.
Well, Tom, I want to thank you very much for coming down and being with us today and going over the results of what we consider to be a very successful and a very dynamic program. And I think that we can tell our audience that the peregrine falcon has a very good chance of being returned to New Jersey, certainly as a resident bird, which we have now, and hopefully within a few years as a nesting and a breeding bird right here in the Garden State. Thank you for being with us.